In an ancient village deep within a valley, there lived a carpenter known as the old woodcrafter. All his life, he poured his heart into building the most magnificent structures, from communal houses and temples to precious wooden mansions for mandarins. His hands could turn rough logs into intricately carved masterpieces, with rafters, columns, and wooden joints fitting together tightly without the need for a single iron nail. However, as he reached his twilight years, a massive fire reduced a thousand-year-old temple he had spent half his life restoring to ashes. Looking at the blackened ironwood columns collapsing into ash in the wind, the old man suddenly realized a cruel truth. The greatest things created by human hands cannot withstand the erosion of time and impermanence. He packed a few basic tools, left his prosperous workshop behind, and decided to step into the dark, primeval forest. He wanted to find a kind of eternal wood, or at least find an answer to the fleeting existence of human life. The old forest welcomed him with eerie sounds and cold darkness. Giant ancient trees stood tall, blocking the sunlight, their roots intertwining like giant snakes under the rotting leaves. At night, the wind howled through the canopy, creating a mournful wailing, like the souls of all things that had once been born and died on this land. The old woodcrafter paid no mind to the fear. He utilized his survival skills and built a makeshift shelter. He learned to start a fire from pebbles, find crystal-clear spring water seeping from the cliffs, and forage for wild mushrooms and berries. Living amidst wild nature, he realized that human beings are, in fact, very small. The standards of fame and wealth in the mortal world mean nothing in the face of a great forest storm. Every day he wandered deeper into the woods, observing how saplings grew from the decaying remains of fallen ancient trees. Life and death are not two parallel lines, but a closed circle of reincarnation. One day, by the bank of a dried-up stream, the old man found a massive redwood tree that had fallen hundreds of years ago, yet its core was still as hard as stone, completely untouched by termites. Overjoyed, he decided to use this trunk to carve a statue, a testament to the immortality he had been seeking. He used saws, chisels, and swung his sledgehammer hard onto the wooden wedges to split the trunk lengthwise. The deafening sound of the sledgehammer echoed, shattering the silence of the forest. With the first strike, he thought of his lost fame. With the second strike, he mourned the structures that had turned to dust. With the third strike, he poured his wrath into what is called fate. But the tree trunk was too hard. In a swing fueled by all his strength and resentment, the sledgehammer deflected and violently struck a sharp hidden rock. The handle snapped in two. The old woodcrafter collapsed to his knees, his hands bleeding, his chest heaving. He looked at the shattered sledgehammer, then back at the unyielding tree trunk. At that very moment, he suddenly awakened to a realization. Forcing things against their nature is the root of all suffering. He had used anger and resentment in the hope of creating something eternal, but eternity is never born from coercion. That wooden core had survived for hundreds of years because it followed nature, allowing the rain and wind to wash away its outer bark, keeping only its purest essence inside. As he sat in a daze by the stream, a gigantic figure stepped out from the bushes. It was an old white elephant, its gray, wrinkled skin marked with the scars of time. Strangely, both sides of the elephant's mouth were bare, completely devoid of tusks. The rough scars at the base of the tusks showed they had been stripped away a long time ago. The old elephant did not seem to be in pain or harbor any hatred. It slowly used its powerful trunk to gather dry branches, clearing an open space. Then, it quietly plucked tender branches to eat, its eyes incredibly gentle and calm. The old woodcrafter looked at the elephant, a wave of shame washing over him. That majestic creature had been robbed of its greatest weapon and pride, its magnificent tusks. Yet it did not resent the green forest, nor did it go mad over the loss. It accepted its flawed body and continued living its final days in silence, in harmony with heaven and earth. He murmured to himself, realizing that letting go does not mean throwing everything away, but keeping the mind untethered by what has been lost. No longer intending to carve the eternal statue, the old man decided to spend the rest of his life building a small hut right in the clearing the old elephant had made. This time, he did not use a sledgehammer to force the wood to his will. He gathered dry branches and fallen bamboo around the forest, weaving vines to use as ties. He applied the most primitive building techniques, not erecting solid walls to shield against wind and rain, but only raising 4 rustic pillars and a sparse palm leaf roof. The hut had no doors, no walls, empty on all 4 sides. When the hut was finished, a forest rainstorm arrived. The wind swept through the hut, carrying a cool mist. Rainwater fell from the thatched roof, forming a transparent curtain. The old woodcrafter sat in meditation in the middle of the hut, understanding the philosophy of emptiness. The true value of a bowl lies not in the clay molded to make it, but in the empty space inside to hold water. The value of a house lies not in its walls or roof, but in the empty space for people to live in. Everything in the world needs empty space. If the human heart is constantly filled with greed, anger, ignorance, and calculations of gain and loss, how can there be room for peace to reside? In his final years, the old woodcrafter lived like a silent ghost of the old forest. He no longer remembered his own name or age, nor did he remember the magnificent structures of the past. He befriended flocks of birds, the tuskless old elephant, and the rotting tree stumps. He had contemplated the truths of human life, accepting impermanence to cherish the present, living softly and tolerantly like the nature of water, and finding true happiness from inner fulfillment by casting off illusions and greed. On a foggy morning covering the valley, the old elephant walked to the rock next to the dried stream, lay down and closed its eyes forever, taking its last breath to merge with the mist of the great forest. The old man sat beside his old friend, stroking its rough skin. He did not cry, for he knew the cycle was complete. A few days later, hunters who had wandered deep into the forest found a small thatched hut, empty on all sides. In the middle of the hut was the pure white skeleton of an old man, sitting in a lotus meditation posture, his face turned towards the rising sun, seemingly smiling. Around the hut, moss and ferns had begun to creep up the pillars. The old forest was slowly embracing his body, turning him back into earth, into humus, into a new source of life for the rising sprouts. There was no deafening sound of a sledgehammer, no roaring of fire, only the babbling of the stream and the rustling of dry leaves. The story of the woodcrafter seeking eternity ended in silence. He had found what he wanted, not in a redwood tree as hard as stone, but in the very serenity of accepting to let go, allowing himself to dissolve and merge completely into the eternal cycle of the vast universe. Human life is like a long dream. Some dream they are kings, some dream they are beggars. But when they wake up, everything is just an empty void. Live like a tree, root deeply into the earth, stretch your branches to catch the light, and when autumn comes, be ready to let your leaves fall without any complaint. Time flew by, and in the blink of an eye, decades had passed since the day the old woodcrafter turned to dust. The primeval forest grew increasingly gloomy, dense, and enveloped in a thick fog. Villagers in the surrounding area began whispering chilling tales about the Forest of Lost Souls, a place where wandering spirits often wailed in the wind and ghostly trees could move on their own to bury the living. No one dared to venture near until a Sin appeared. A Sin was a young, arrogant, and ambitious lumberjack and hunter. He entered the deep forest not to seek the philosophy of life, but to hunt for precious 1,000-year-old ironwood and redwood stumps to exchange for wealth and glory. He brought along all sorts of sharp tools, chainsaws, iron nails, and a heavy sledgehammer, believing that his supreme survival skills and physical strength could conquer any obstacle of the great forest. But the Forest of Lost Souls did not welcome those with a mindset of conquest and greed. One twilight, thick black fog suddenly rose from the rotting ground, carrying a bone-chilling cold. Flickering dark shadows glided among the ancient tree trunks like besieging vengeful spirits. The wind howled mournfully. Trapped amidst the storm, an eerie supernatural phenomena, a Sin panicked. He hastily used his strength to chop down large branches, swinging his sledgehammer to drive in giant iron nails to build a sturdy shelter. He tried to seal every gap, creating a closed fortress in hopes of blocking the storm and the demons lurking outside. However, the hurricane struck with the destructive power of nature. The swirling winds easily ripped out the wooden wedges, bent the iron nails, and tore apart the solid shelter a Sin had just painstakingly built. The lumberjack was thrown far away, his body covered in scratches, his sledgehammer lost in the bushes. He crawled desperately in the dark, facing impending death. In the dying moment of seeking refuge, a sin accidentally stumbled into a strange clearing, a place the storm seemed unable to touch, eerily silent. Amidst the lush green ferns, he saw a rustic hut frame made of bamboo and dry branches, bound together entirely by woven vines using the most primitive techniques. The hut had no walls, no doors, empty on all four sides, yet it stood firmly amidst the tempest, letting the howling wind pass through its empty spaces without any resistance. Right in the middle of the hut was a pure white skeleton, covered in moss, sitting in a perfectly serene lotus meditation posture. Not far away was the giant skeleton of an elephant, completely devoid of tusks. That mystical, desolate scene made all the fear of demons in Asin's heart vanish instantly, giving way to profound reverence. That night, huddled under the tattered thatched roof, in a delirium of exhaustion, Asin saw a vision appear amidst the ruins. An old man with a gentle smile, wearing a torn robe, was quietly gathering fallen branches. The old man used no words but used his very actions to convey the survival skills of nature, striking stones to make fire, filtering water from moss, and especially how to build a shelter that yields to the wind rather than blocking the path of the storm. A warm voice echoed in Asin's mind, reminding him that the more one tries to build solid walls to escape fear, the harder nature will knock on the door. Survival in the great forest does not lie in having sharp weapons or immense strength, but in knowing how to shrink oneself, being empty and soft like the air, opening one's mind wide so the storm can blow through without leaving a scratch. The next morning, when the storm had passed and the warm sunlight pierced through the canopy to dispel the forest miasma, Asin woke up. He looked at his sharp metal tools lying uselessly in the mud, then looked at the primitive hut frame still standing proudly after decades. He had understood the philosophy of empty space. Asin did not cut down another precious tree. He threw away the rusty iron nails, carefully used his bare hands to gather fallen leaves and branches, and applied primitive vine-weaving techniques to repair the tattered thatched roof of the hut as a way to pay tribute to the deceased. He respectfully clasped his hands and bowed to the skeletons of the old woodcrafter and his old elephant friend, then quietly found his way out of the forest of lost souls. From then on, the mortal world forever lost an arrogant, greedy lumberjack, but gained a master of rustic architecture. Asin specialized in building traditional wooden structures, using tight-fitting mortise and tenon joints without a single nail. The structures he built were never suffocating, sealed walls. They always had open spaces, borrowing the shade of trees for a roof, borrowing crevices to welcome the mountain breeze, harmonious and humble before nature. And whenever anyone asked about the secret to creating houses that stand firm against all storms, he would just smile peacefully, his eyes looking towards the distant mountains where the fog-covered forest lay, and slowly reply, "The greatest stability in this world comes not from striving to fight back, but from knowing how to make room for all things to pass through freely." Decades quietly passed by. Asin had now become an old man with silvery white hair and beard, his steps slow yet incredibly steady. His reputation for building breathing wooden houses echoed across the realms, attracting countless people who sought his help. Among them was a wealthy landlord from a distant borderland, who brought vast amounts of gold and silver to kneel before Asin. He begged the old man to build an ancestral hall on Trung Tang, Double Death Hill, a gloomy piece of land heavily burdened by a demonic curse, where terrifying folk tales of ghostly blood sacrifices were passed down. Any builder who tried to erect solid brick and stone walls there was harassed by bizarre supernatural phenomena. Newly built walls would crack and collapse, while wailing cries and lingering dark shadows echoed endlessly through the night. Asin refused the gold and silver, accepting the request solely to dissolve the vengeful resentment of that tragic land. Upon arriving, he forbade the digging of deep foundations or the bringing in of heavy stone blocks. Instead of chopping down fresh young trees reaching for the sunlight, he wandered alone into the neighboring primeval forests, applying core survival skills to search for fallen tree trunks that had cracked from the elements, but whose cores had been tempered by time. He meticulously processed the wood using the most primitive crafting techniques. He absolutely refused to touch any heavy sledgehammer that carried the murderous intent of coercion and destruction. Every chisel strike, every carved line followed the grain of the wood, preserving the most rustic, natural shape of each plank. The mortise and tenon joints were calculated based on the wood's shrinkage according to the weather, allowing the joints to lock tightly together without needing a single piece of metal. The structure was erected rustically yet with exquisite craftsmanship. However, what astonished and even terrified the landlord and the villagers was the design of the ancestral hall. Isin did not enclose the four walls. Instead, he intentionally designed a central corridor piercing straight through the middle of the building, completely open, with no doors blocking the way. The direction of the corridor was meticulously calculated to align with the draft of the valley wind, blowing from the abandoned well at the foot of the hill to the mountain peak. When the landlord questioned why there was such a large hole in the middle of a place of worship, Asin merely pondered and replied, "The living need space for peace of mind, but vengeful spirits also need a path so they are not imprisoned. Blocking the wind's path will cause the storm to knock down the house. Binding the path of spirits will cause resentment to swallow the whole clan." On the night the ancestral hall was completed, a hurricane struck, bringing thick black fog and horrifying shrieks heavily tinged with demonic lore. Vengeful ghosts surged from the depths of the earth, carrying aggressive spiritual power, intending to shatter the newly built structure, just as they had done countless times before. However, upon encountering Asin's ancestral hall, that surge of resentment found no sealed wall to unleash its destructive force against. Instead of colliding and destroying, they were drawn into the empty space, the open corridor path. The ghostly wind swept past the rustic columns entirely unhindered, escaping straight out the back of the hill, slowly dissipating into the vast void of heaven and earth. The house twisted along with the wind, the wooden mortise joints grinding against each other to produce deep, creaking sounds, but they absolutely did not break. The next morning, Trung Tang Hill welcomed the clear rays of dawn sunlight for the very first time, no longer shrouded in any gloomy miasma. The landlord fell to his knees before Asin in a flood of tears. The old carpenter calmly brushed the layer of sawdust off his robe, quietly picked up his woven rattan tool bag, and turned his back, walking away towards the horizon. Throughout his entire life, starting from an arrogant man who wanted to use force to conquer nature, he had finally understood the greatest truth. There is no defense more solid than compassion and letting go, making way for all things to follow the law of impermanence. Leaving Trung Tang Hill, Asin followed the trail covered in fallen leaves down into the valley. At the foot of the hill, although the fog had thinned thanks to the vital energy from the ancestral hall at the top, the atmosphere remained thick with melancholy as he approached the dried-up ancient well. This place was once the witness to the horrific blood sacrifice at the abandoned well years ago, where innocent lives were pushed into the depleted depths due to the selfishness and fear of mortals. Beside the crumbling well wall covered in black moss, a frail figure was desperately smashing at it. It was a skinny, ragged old man, known by the locals as Old Man Seven Ga. On his back, he always carried a black rooster in a woven rattan basket, believing that the crow of its yang energy would drive away the spirits haunting him. He was the very shaman who had presided over the blood sacrifice years ago. For decades, tightly bound by karma and torment, he had been half mad and half lucid, determined to cling to the bottom of this valley. At this moment, the old man was frantically swinging a heavy sledgehammer, smashing it deafeningly against the wall of the well. The sound of metal striking the boulders sparked cold embers. He screamed, tears streaming down his face, wanting to use the power of the sledgehammer to level the well, burying the crimes and the mournful wails that still echoed in his mind every night. But the stones were hard, and human strength was exhausted. The sledgehammer tearing through the wind only sent fragments flying to bite into his flesh, while the well remained unyielding. Asin quietly stepped forward, extending his rough, sinewy hand to firmly grasp the handle of the sledgehammer, swinging in the air. Old Man Seven Ga froze, his bloodshot eyes looking up at the old carpenter. Asin asked gently, his warm voice blending with the rustling of the forest leaves, "This sledgehammer can crush bricks and stones, but can it shatter the guilt in your mind?" The old shaman let his arms drop, collapsing into the mud, covering his face and sobbing that he had killed them. that he wanted to destroy this well so they couldn't climb up to claim his life, that he was so scared, wondering why such a large hammer couldn't smash his memories. Asin sat down on a nearby stone, looking deep into the dark bottom of the well. He suddenly realized that Old Man Seven Guy was a mirror reflecting his own image from when he was an arrogant lumberjack, always thinking that force and evasion could solve the laws of heaven and earth. He gently explained that the more he used the sledgehammer to smash, the more deeply he engraved the existence of the well in his heart. Like building a wall to block the wind, the angry wind will knock the wall down. The sin does not lie in those stones, but in attachment, clinging to the rooster to seek protection, using a sledgehammer to hope to destroy the past. In reality, he was imprisoning himself in the abandoned well of karma. Sitting before the trembling old shaman, Asin suddenly found his mind unusually still, and a final layer of life's philosophy finally dawned on his consciousness. For decades, Asin had been proud of realizing the philosophy of empty space, proud of building wooden houses in harmony with nature, helping people dissipate vengeful resentment. But at this very moment, he realized that such pride was also a form of attachment. The fact that he always considered himself a master architect, an enlightened one who goes around saving others, was ultimately just a sophisticated disguise of the ego. Human life is essentially a journey of unburdening. When young, people yearn to shoulder wealth and fame. When growing old, they learn to discard material things to shoulder philosophies and self-righteous titles. But the most subtle burden, the hardest to cast off, is the perception of one's own greatness. He murmured, his eyes looking towards the reddening horizon. It turns out the most complete human life is not about leaving behind a glorious legacy or a structure that never decays. Rather, it is living a life without beginning or end, coming like a breeze and leaving without a trace. Asin took the sledgehammer from Old Man Seven Gah's hand, but not to smash the well. He used the handle of the hammer to gently pry away the layers of mud jammed around the well's mouth, clearing a small trench so that spring water from the hill could trickle in, purifying the dry dregs of decades. Then, Asin turned, smiled, and took down the woven rattan basket from the old shaman's back, letting the black rooster out. The creature freely flapped its wings, hopped onto a rotting stump, stretched its neck, and let out a resounding crow, piercing through the final layer of fog in the valley. The crow was not to drive away demons, but to welcome the beginning of a new day. The old shaman looked at the rooster, then at the spring water beginning to trickle down into the deep well, and tears of remorse flowed, washing away the madness on his weathered face. He finally understood that the only way to deliver the wandering souls and to deliver himself was to accept, face it, and use the water of compassion to cleanse, rather than using a sledgehammer in denial. When the old shaman turned back to bow in gratitude, Asin was no longer there. The master of rustic architecture had quietly left, even leaving his woven rattan tool bag by the stream. He walked deep into the vast great forest, taking graceful steps, carrying no title, philosophy, or complacency anymore. The highest realm of human life is not learning how to hold on, nor is it learning how to let go. The highest realm is realizing from the very beginning that inherently nothing belongs to us to hold or release. We are born from dust, weaving a long dream amidst the mortal world, only to smile and dissolve into the void when dawn breaks. Asin's journey after leaving Trungtang Valley was no longer the footsteps of a person burdened by physical form and ego. He blended into the desolate mountains and forests, where the ultimate philosophies of human life gradually revealed themselves amidst the endless white clouds. Unarmed, Asin stepped deep into the heart of the great forest, where no human footprint had ever been. No longer possessing a tool bag, plumb line, or measuring tape, he walked with absolute ease. When hungry, he foraged for wild berries and forest mushrooms. When thirsty, he scooped up clear spring water. At night, he relied on the hollows of ancient trees or shallow stone caves to rest. His survival skills merged with the instincts of wild beasts, seeking no comfort, only following the arrangements of nature. On a late autumn day, when bright red maple leaves dyed a corner of the sky, Asin stopped before a large river. The rushing water flowed fiercely, pitch black and profound, washing away everything in its path. On this side was the old forest stirring to prepare for the brutal winter. On the other side was a sunlit plain filled with brilliant carpets of flowers, a beautiful illusion of the shore of enlightenment that all living beings yearned to reach. By the riverbank, a drenched young man was frantically swinging a sledgehammer, driving large wooden stakes into the shore in an attempt to bind a raft. But the river was too fierce. Every time the young man joined a few logs together, the aggressive water surged forward, tearing the joints apart and sweeping everything away. The young man screamed, cursing the river, cursing the fate that obstructed his path to the promised land. Asin quietly sat down on a mossy rock, calmly watching the fallen leaves swirling and gently drifting along the current, neither sinking nor being crushed. Seeing a silver-haired old man sitting there, the young man carried his sledgehammer and ran over, panting as he begged the old man to show him how to cross the river, complaining that he had used all his strength and his heaviest sledgehammer to build the raft. But the river seemed possessed by demons determined to drown him. Asin smiled, pointing at the roaring water, and explained, "This river is the flow of time and desire. The raft you are trying to bind together with that sledgehammer is your ego. You use anger and coercive strength in the hope of crossing the flow of life and death. How can you not be torn apart by it?" The young man stood stunned, dropping the hammer's handle, wondering if he shouldn't build a raft. Was he supposed to stand on this dark shore forever and freeze to death? Asin picked up a dry maple leaf and gently dropped it at the water's edge. The leaf followed a vortex, floating out into the middle of the current without any resistance. The old man pondered and continued, "The other shore is just an illusion woven by your mind when you despise the reality on the shore. As long as you distinguish between the shore of delusion and the shore of enlightenment, between suffering and happiness, you will be forever trapped in the river of torment. The truly enlightened do not seek to build a raft across the river. They realize that the river does not inherently exist, and the other shore is actually where you are standing right now, if only your mind stops wandering." The young man watched the leaf drift away, suddenly awakening. He looked back at his desperate efforts, looking at the bulky, murderously useless sledgehammer lying on the sand. He knelt down, bowed to Asin once, then turned and walked into the misty forest. He no longer needed to cross the river, for he had found peace right on this desolate shore. That winter struck the great forest, bringing blinding blizzards. Asin went no further. He climbed halfway up a majestic limestone mountain, where a small cave overlooked the entire valley. He did not use any tools. With his bare, calloused hands, he gathered dry leaves and broken pine branches, weaving them together into a warm nest of leaves right at the cave entrance. The wildest, most rustic survival skill he had learned from the very beginning. He sat in the middle of the leaf nest, crossing his legs in a lotus position, his eyes tightly closed. The temperature dropped to the extreme of coldness, but his body heat still radiated a strange warmth, completely harmonizing with the cold of heaven and earth. In his deep meditation, Asin's consciousness drifted back to fragmented memories. He saw the image of the old woodcrafter sitting in meditation amidst the storm. He saw the tuskless old elephant from years ago, leisurely walking through the pine forest sparkling with snow. The elephant had no tusks to fight with, nor weapons to defend itself, but it carried an absolute freedom. Without tusks, there would be no hunters. Carrying no pride, it would never be hurt by loss. Asin smiled. He had completely shed the most subtle elephant tusk in his soul, the concept of the existence of what is called a sin. The blizzard raged on for 3 days and 3 nights. When the sun broke through, shining its golden rays on the mountain, the ice and snow began to melt, forming sparkling drops of water falling from the cliffs. Inside the cave, amidst the rotting nest of dry leaves, Asin's figure still sat there, as steady as a 1,000-year-old rock. But the beating of his heart had quietly stopped at some unknown time. His physical body showed no signs of pain or struggle. His face was gentle and serene, the corners of his mouth still holding a peaceful smile that embraced all things. He left no suicide note, no final instructions, nor any disciples to pass on the skills of tight-fitting wooden joints or building walls without partitions. He came to this world with the cry of a newborn, struggled in desire and arrogance, went through suffering to learn how to let go, and finally he chose to depart in the absolute silence of the great forest. Larks flew into the cave, perching on his shoulder and chirping. A few curious squirrels picked up wild chestnuts and dropped them into his freezing hands. Nature did not consider his death a tragic end. The old forest welcomed him back, like welcoming a fallen leaf returning to its roots, like a small puddle of water evaporating into clouds flying back to the sky. Many years later, if anyone happened to pass by that mountain, they would no longer see a sin's physical form. His bones had dissolved into the mud, nourishing a young pine tree growing strong and green amidst the sheer cliff. That pine tree rooted deeply into the hard rock, its trunk stretching straight to welcome the wind and storms, its branches and leaves swaying without resentment, without seeking anything. The epic of the carpenter seeking the truth of life came to a close. There was no radiant heaven, no Buddhist realm shining with blinding halos, only the eternal silence of a life that had fully understood the cycle of reincarnation. All things are born from emptiness, taking on a temporary form before returning to emptiness again. Those who hold on to the past drown in torment. Those who cling to the future wither away in anxiety. Only those who know how to spread their hearts wide like the void, living fully in the present moment, can truly taste the flavor of eternity. Do not try to carve your name into stone. Let the wind blow away all traces, for the greatest freedom of human life is to be forgotten.